Hello, dear listeners. This is Christopher Cohen from QA Wolf, and welcome to Wolfed, the podcast that digs in with engineering leaders to discover what's made them a success. So on today's episode, how savoring your failures can help you become a better leader, why it's important to take accountability when you give your team permission to take risks, and some of the cultural differences between startups versus large corporations. I was lucky enough to hear about all these topics and more when I sat down with Andy Parsons. That's the Senior Director of the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe. I found it very on brand that Andy puts a strong emphasis on authenticity, not just in the work that he does, but also as a people leader and as a mentor. He definitely walks the walk, so to speak. I'm very excited to chat with you about your current role at Adobe. But before we get there, I do want to understand kind of like where you started, ask you a bit about your illustrious career along the way, and find out how you ended up where you are now. So generally for me, that starts with kind of just understanding like what was your first exposure to software engineering in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's particularly timely for me. I have a college-age daughter who naturally is thinking about what she's going to do with her life. And she's looked to me with the, if you want to call it success that I've had in my career and said, you must have known what you were going to do right from the get-go. And you graduated college and you had a plan. She's like, I'm not one of those people with a plan. And I say, well, guess what? I was not one of those people either. I didn't have a plan. So I'd love to tell you I was like a computer nerd, started programming when I was 5. I guess I was a computer nerd, but my entry into kind of technology was through video games, also a common story. But I was the first kid on my block. I'll be dating myself a number of times in this conversation, so we might as well just start now. I was the first kid on my block with a ColecoVision. It was a way to get social street cred because nobody else had one, and it was kind of expensive. And everybody come over to my house and be like, cool, I'm cool because I have this piece of technology. But then I did sort of nerd out. My dad was a sales engineer for an electronics company. So we had all sorts of, we call them do-nothing boxes around the house growing up. And I was encouraged, to my parents' credit, to take those things apart. They weren't very valuable anyway. And the value to me and to my dad was like figuring out how they work. So switches and lights and electronics. And I got the bug and did all the like Radio Shack kits when I was a kid. I think probably in retrospect, the idea that you could take a bunch of loose things, whether it's code later in my career or wires and resistors and capacitors, and make something functional and maybe useful has sort of threaded throughout everything I've done. But it wasn't a direct path. My first real technology job was at Prodigy. We can get into what that was all about. But I was kind of finding my way. I was also a musician. My second passion throughout life has been music. I'm a jazz saxophonist and composer. Did that professionally for a while. So it's a bit of a kind of winding journey to get to where I am now. But I also, did some work in music technology. And I find that putting together your passions like music and technology obviously go well together. That is a really nice thing. So I think one of the questions you had floated when we were preparing was, what do you do to unwind? I think I want to say, get away from work. A lot of people say that. I think I've said that at some points, but sometimes like the most relaxing thing for me is to like stop doing technology management for a minute and write some code or explore a new AI LLM or, play some electronic drums. So I really love what I do. Hopefully that'll be clear to your listeners and to you. But it really was a little bit of just a winding journey to get here.
So do you actually find, it's funny that you mentioned this because I've seen this commonality between engineering and music a lot. Has that been your experience as well?
I hear that all the time, and I used to be skeptical. I used to say, well, people say that and it makes sense. And it's like, music is mathematical. Of course, that's true. Rhythm is math. But then in my short-lived music career, like I moved to New York to study music in grad school. I actually met a bunch of people who were introduced to me as musicians, only to get to know them and find out that they were also technology nerds and maybe even had a day job like me later in my career in New York. So I think it is true, but I'm not sure what the reason is. It's not as simple as saying it's math. And, frankly, I wasn't that good at math. And I always struggled with making computers do the math for me, which is one of the things I love about programming. So I don't know. I do find it's true, but I don't think there's a simple explanation for it.
I can definitely agree with that. I think it probably is a little bit all over the place, but I definitely noticed the pattern, which is why I asked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it sounds like too, you're often when folks get to a level of a senior director or even higher, like we get, like you said, more into the management side of things, and you're less hands on with the actual coding. But so you've made a point of keeping that in your life at least somewhere, that you actually like to get your fingers on the keyboard.
I do. And I think that's, you're not going to find me to be the CTO of a 500-person engineering team. I've never done it. I've attempted to run large engineering teams and succeeded, only to realize that it's not really where my passion is. There's a certain kind of individual who really has mastered organizational dynamics. I think I've got like a lot of road wear and tear, and I've learned a lot of lessons the hard way, which for me is the best way to learn lessons. Still happens, which is to screw something up and feel the pain. And learn. And that goes to mentoring as well. Like some of the best lessons I've ever learned firsthand or second or third hand are what not to do. But for me, like part of my leadership style is to be, credible to lower level engineers, product people. So it does require me to stay current and spend a fair amount of time kind of closer to the metal than a leader of, a CTO of a 1,000-person company. So, degrees of scale are limited for me, but I find that I command a good amount of respect and camaraderie and collaboration on my teams because I continue to be able to talk the talk and ask good questions and sometimes even have an answer now and then.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring that up, because that's something I've discussed with a few other folks as well, which is like, where do we draw this line when it comes to leadership in the tech industry? Do you think it's important that CTOs or VPs of engineering, any high level leader, directors, like, should they come from an engineering background? Should that be the rule across the board? Is there room in the industry for folks who maybe don't have hands-on experience but still understand how to lead a tech org?
I think, yeah, there's room for all of those. And in fact, I think it goes even further. So if you are a CTO or a former VP of engineering, we've got some really wonderful success stories in the CTO club that, as you mentioned, I co-organize, which is full of veterans of the industry, folks who are running, smaller startups, folks who are the CTO of a giant media company. And this third class of people who have made the transition to CEO, either founding their own companies, as I have done, or, taking over the reins, graduating from CTO to CEO. And I think, I'm biased here, and you may be too, like that, understanding how to build things. So I've seen the same with like chief product officers who go on to become CEOs. But I do think there's something really interesting and powerful about a chief technology officer, somebody who's run an engineering team, who understands the ethos of engineering, has real respect for how products get built, especially in software, who then takes over the reins and is responsible for, massive P&Ls and perhaps venture capital boards and governance of a company, because you have that sort of sympathy, understanding, and the ability, quite frankly, to call BS on your product teams and engineering teams and say, let's BS in the best possible way, of course.
Right.
Say, let's figure out another strategy and be able to dive down just to the right level to again, be credible with your CTO or your VP of engineering or your chief product officer or your CFO, who's responsible for funding all those things, and put the pieces together in a way that somebody with less technical experience, I think, has to learn. But a really solid CTO kind of comes into a role like a real high-level leadership role with those skills, because if you've gotten to the level of CTO, you will have earned them.
Right, that makes sense. And I wonder, like, in your own personal experience, if we kind of rewind a little bit back to when you were working more as an IC, as a dev, was that something that struck you? Was that important to you at the time that your leaders had that experience, or did you have experience both ways, or what do you think?
Yeah, so if I rewind the clock, I think I probably felt the way a lot of young engineers or people entering the field feel, which is they look at the CEO or the chief product officer and say, man, I could do that job better than they can. Now, that's not because they're not engineers. It's because there's a certain conceit when you enter the career field. But I do think like there's a powerful engineering mentality that flourishes in the best people I've ever worked with, that is knowing how things work and how they're built. And I do think there's a really clear translation. People are APIs to some degree. People are people, but the understanding the org dynamics has a lot to do with understanding how people interact with one another. A good portion of leadership is number one, optimizing the team you have, but number two, kind of micro optimizing the way they interact with you and with each other. And that's, when you say, hey, I noticed in that meeting, you're really defensive, and that wasn't helpful. Try X, Y, Z. Like, try this strategy. I think it'll serve you better, and it'll serve the team better. That's kind of a matter of optimizing the interface between individuals. And again, I think that like recognizing those impedance mismatches between people, without overburdening the metaphor, is not that different from putting APIs and code together and saying, why doesn't this work? And I'm going to focus on this until it works better. And then most importantly, recognizing when you've succeeded in optimizing and moving on.
I love that analogy, and such a developer's way to look at it, but so true.
I think it's right.
So,
yeah.
So, and you mentioned, like, I think ICs come into the field with a certain level of conceit. And so in your own personal experience, as you moved into your first director roles, like maybe at Icon Nicholson, what surprised you about actually now taking the reins of leadership? And do you think you would have the same experience today if you were that age again and making this transition now?
Well, I think that this is the wonderful thing that happens if you're sort of rather suddenly moved into a management role of any kind, which I think is the way most engineers find themselves in a management role. In my experience, it's relatively rare that somebody says, I'm ready for management. Hey, boss, can I manage a team? It's more often the case that your company is scaling in a way, somebody has left, and they tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, Christopher, I need you to manage this team. And it's awesome. Management is great. You should totally do it. And you say, sure. I know Michael Lopp, Rams, in his many books, which I've learned a lot from, who's worked at Apple and Slack and tons of companies, has chapters in his books and volumes of blog posts about this, about his personal experience, sort of literally being tapped on the shoulder saying, I need you to manage this team right now. So what happens to that conceit that you have coming in saying, I could do that, I could be the CEO, like I could make these decisions. This person's not that great. As soon as you find yourself with any level of responsibility, you find that conceit very quickly gets evaporated because you can't do a better job. You can't do a better job without hard-earned experience. And everywhere you could succeed, writing code, talking to your colleagues, releasing code, there's something very transactional about engineering, which is like you either know something or you don't. If you don't, there's usually like a very clear path to learn it with a time frame associated. With people and personalities and management, it's not that, because I don't care what management books you've read, and I've read most of them. Whether it's a pamphlet or a tweet or a blog post or a book, the reason those books sell so well, and don't get me wrong, there's pieces of wisdom in all of them, is because we're all looking for a recipe for success. And the reason there are so many such books is because there's no single recipe for success. It's very context dependent in a way that writing code is not. So yeah, it was a bit of a rude awakening. If I were back there again, I would probably have the wisdom to relish the rude awakening and say, now it's time to fail in the spirit of learning how to do this job right. And frankly, savor the failure, which is a hard thing to learn.
Right. And as you said, like that is often the best way to learn, although at the same time, I'm sure the most difficult way, and painful way, but sometimes, and so I suppose, like you're saying, since there is no one recipe for this and it is so context dependent, would you say it really is the way to get better at this is just the hard knocks of failure and trial and error? Or have you, with your various CTO roles over the years, have you found some commonality in terms of like, well, here's how you tackle this?
Yeah, I think there is commonality, but the more commonality you recognize, the more it is a consequence, more or less, of the opportunities you've chosen or the opportunities that have chosen you, right? Again, I don't think I could walk into a massive company if I could even land a role like that and say, I haven't done a lot of managing of 1,000 engineers, but what I've done like translates directly, or a different business vertical that I'm not particularly interested in or attracted to. Like, there are reasons that your experience begets more experience, and you tend to gravitate towards things you love and things enough to be effective, but where there's still opportunities to have some hard knocks and learn. And all of my roles have been that, including my current role at Adobe. There's still a lot of learning. Hopefully none of my colleagues will hear this right now, but there's also a little bit of failure now and then. And I love that. So I think it depends largely on the individual. And of course, to a small extent, there are patterns in people. Like I used to get excited about reading and seeing other leaders and sort of mentors of mine say, "Oh, I recognize this kind of person. That's an XYZ." And a lot of management books will actually attach names to types of personalities. I find that's helpful to sort of exercise your management chops. But in reality, as soon as you inject a real person's personality, their desires, their goals, their life experience, it's much more complex and nuanced than that. And that's where, as a manager, I savor and love the kind of nuances of building effective teams or optimizing existing teams to be more effective. And it's much more that sort of in the moment courage to try things, and once in a while, like a pattern recognition that says, okay, I've seen this before. I know exactly what to do. But for me, that's the minority of cases.
And so, and maybe one of these situations that maybe you've now seen a couple times, but I'm sure it was a challenge at the time, is like, so at Exchange Path, for instance, you were brought in as an outside leader, brought in to oversee kind of a tight knit and experienced development team. Is that, you know, how do you navigate a challenge like that? And how have you learned from, like, okay, well, now that you're the outsider, how do you integrate yourself? How do you get them to trust you? What should you expect? What have you learned to do or not do?
Yeah, that's a great segue. So that was the first role, not the last one, but the first role where I was the leader brought in, as you said, facing potential organ rejection. I'll get back to that in a second. Where the younger, even the seasoned engineers, but certainly the younger engineers who had more experience with that company than I did, were looking at me and saying, maybe I could do the job better than that guy, and definitely could do the job better than the last guy. It was a learning. What I learned there is to know your audience. Like if you're coming into a company, it's very important before you start making any kind of decision, even something that seems trivial. Like I'll give you an example. Like in that role, I thought I knew which tools, for bug tracking and just simple stuff. I was like, oh, this system and this process you guys have kind of sucks. I've had better experience with something else. Now, you're laughing because obviously the way I tell the story, it's like, oh, noob mistake. Yeah, it sure was. And I think the degree of sort of backlash that I got right away wasn't so much about that particular decision. It wasn't about it being right or whether, Jira sucks and something else is better. It was much more about making a quick decision without getting to know the team and understanding how they got to where they are. So in subsequent roles, and again, that's a hard lesson because that resulted in some tough learning, and some apologies and some learning something about myself, which is like, you can be confident without sort of imposing your will on somebody who doesn't know you yet. So those things take time. It's often the case that you enter a new company, a new role. I've heard various, depending on the size of the team, various statistics about, well, you have like the first 3 months or the first 6 months, depending on the size of the team, maturity of the organization, to make real changes. And I've had people and observed people, do this with varying degrees of success. Make changes, change up the team, reorg the team, because you have that early sort of outsider's view. And what I've learned is you have to temper the outsider view, which is great. Like before you become indoctrinated in the culture of the company and the history of the company, it is important to make changes, but not before you've invested enough time to get to know the people well enough to understand where they're coming from, where the pitfalls are. So it's often recommended, and I learned this the hard way. And if I ever write a book or a tweet about this, I'll say this. You have to take that first month or two to do a little bit of a roadshow, and not only show people that you're open to listening, but that you're going to take action based on what you've heard. Companies aren't democracies, right? You're not voting when I talk to you or meet you, but I'm building up sort of muscle memory that I don't walk in with about what's happened before, what's worked and what hasn't worked. And if it hasn't worked, to begin to understand why. Again, is that leadership? Is it something endemic to the culture of the company? Is this even something I need to care about, or are there bigger fish to fry? So the know your audience mantra is one that I carry with me still.
It sounds like kind of a through line so far has been like this idea of the tough moments that we learn from, and making certain mistakes so that you learn and grow from them and do better next time. I'm sure this, I mean, this is somewhat of a broad question. I'm sure this has happened throughout your career many times, but do you think of kind of key moments, especially as a CTO at certain companies, of like big mistakes we made that like totally changed your perspective as an engineering leader moving forward?
Oh, yeah. How much time do you have?
We've got at least 40 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, there are lots of those moments. I think, veering away from like people management for a minute, um, one of the things that I've learned and from talking to people and seeing other leaders succeed and sort of thinking about how the people I respect most succeed in technology leadership roles, it's being accountable for decisions. So there's a moment that crops up relatively frequently. Like if you're a CTO and you haven't had one of these moments, I would say you're probably doing something wrong. And that is, there needs to be a decision, right? One of the things that leadership requires of you is to be decisive. It's not always the case that you can be decisive with all the information. I think this is not true just of technology leadership, but of leadership in general, which is the organization and the people who you work with are depending on you to make a decision so that they can move forward. And you have to be accountable for that decision. And also transparent and vulnerable in a way to say, look, I'm going to make the best decision I can given the information I have. But to be honest with you, team, it might not be the right one. Now, if I build up a history of making bad decisions, that's not good either, because people will say, yeah, no kidding, it's never the right one, Andy. But the truth is, in life, you have two kinds of decisions. One, you have the luxury of being very well informed and therefore very confident in your decision. The other is you're not well informed, but you have an appetite for risk that helps other people move forward, and then that requires the courage to change course when you realize that something is wrong. But in both cases, you need to be accountable for that decision, and your team needs to understand that you're accountable. You effectively give them permission to take a risk or to execute well on something that's less risky in a certain amount of time. And I have many, many examples of that, from choosing a platform to a business partnership to accelerate technology that may have ultimately slowed it down. Choosing programming languages, in order to recruit people. One of the things I've been accused of in a very lovely way that I am happy to wear as a badge of honor is, being on the bleeding edge of technologies. I've built companies and startup stacks based on Clojure or TypeScript before that was fashionable. React is a no-brainer these days, but in the early days, it wasn't a no-brainer. It was like, this is from Facebook, and what's the ulterior motive, and what's wrong with plain old HTML? There are companies, I haven't ventured into Haskell as a startup language, but I know people who have, and I find them fascinating. But, that's just one kind of decision. It's like, balancing the team ethos around a particular product that might not, a particular language, for example, that might not be in the best interest of the product you're building. So making those decisions, realizing that they are good and will stand, and also realizing that they may not, and then being accountable is just a theme that I think everybody who's in this kind of role has experienced and probably would agree.
Yeah, I mean, I would think absolutely, but it is nice to hear it framed that way. I'm curious how it's a little bit different, maybe when it comes to maybe a company like Workframe, where you are not just the CTO, but you're founding your own company. How did the dynamics of being a founder affect how you approached these sorts of priorities while being an engineering leader?
Yeah, it's definitely different. So as a founder, effectively, in my case, there were two other co-founders. So there were three of us. We were all sort of CEOs. We had a vertical expertise. That's why we came together. We had an interest in an idea that brought us together. In the case of Workframe, it was about empowering creative professionals in the architecture industry to do amazing things faster, cheaper, and more. And my interest in it was based on two things. One, having played around in my music career with being a creative pro myself, understanding the financial pressures and how technology can help those pressures, help you scale against those pressures, was really interesting. And then, it was a lot of WebGL and like amazing browser technologies that I was just like really eager to get my hands into as a leader and as a team builder. So that's all fun, but you have much more visibility on how much money you've raised. I'm raising money, understanding the limits of the funds you've raised. And, when you have a cushy corporate job, for lack of a better term, where, somebody's sort of drawing down cash to fund your team, but there's always something there. There's always like a little spigot of something. Of course, there are pressures to spend less or spend more, accelerate, decelerate. But when you're looking at the bank balance as a founder, it's much more visceral and much more impactful, and frankly, sometimes much more distracting. And it makes, in our last bit of our conversation, makes being accountable different in that now you're not only accountable for a decision you make, but in some cases where it is prudent to disclose, for explaining why. The best thing for the product might be to accelerate right now, but you're looking at your dwindling bank account with your co-founders saying we can't do both things. We can't violate the laws of physics and accelerate to get to market, beat the other people, nor can we get more money right now. So we've got to find a happy middle ground. Those are things that you just don't really have to deal with. For example, you mentioned Icon Nicholson or Exchange Pass, both extremely well-funded companies. Icon Nicholson being a service industry, it was clear, there was always a good pipeline because the upper level management had a good pipeline of clients. Client work is very predictable. The money coming in for a given project, the number of projects, you just multiply it. When you're fighting a market as a startup founder, it's not the case, right? You don't really know how to price your product. You don't know what kind of engineers to hire in terms of the price point to get the output you want. And you're trying to build a team that you're excited to go to work with every day. So these are, in the best cases, somewhat at odds. So it's very, very different and it stems from looking at the bank balance every day and losing sleep over it.
And I wonder if you feel after that experience, like, is it almost an irreconcilable difference at that point? Like, do you need a division between tech leadership and the co-founders so that there's someone who can be purely a dreamer and not have to worry about that bottom line? Or does it end up kind of being a cohesive experience?
I think it's the latter mostly. And the reason is, especially as a technology leader, like you can do extraordinary things with open source code, for example, right? Every accretive or step function acceleration in your productivity or the product quality doesn't have to cost money. Like there's not a linear relationship between spending money and getting quality output. I think it's probably not the case with sales, for example, right? There's a much more predictable equation in terms of building a sales ops process, putting the right tools in place, hiring the right people, and honing the team. Like those things have a cost that's more or less linear. It's like sell more, spend more to sell more, cost of goods sold. With engineering, I think there's always this seductive ideal that you can do more with less. And I hate that term because, when your boss tells you do more with less, you're always in trouble, right? You're set up for failure. But when you're an engineering leader, especially in a small startup, it's like, look, we can do really amazing things without hiring more people. It's not, put a dime in and get 2 dimes out. So let's bootstrap this thing. And those are some of the most exciting, fun memories I have with lifelong friends I made in the trenches, so to speak, figuring out ways to get faster without spending more money. I love those kinds of pressures. Even now, sort of punching above our weight class with a relatively small team in a big company. I love getting kudos. I love passing them on. I love working with people who figure out ways to accelerate without just having their hand out as a founder or a fundraiser or an engineer saying, if you give me a few more bits of money, or you give me a few more engineers, then I can deliver. Stop and think that maybe you don't need those things, at least not yet. And again, when you're looking at that bank balance, there's no choice but to stop and think. You don't have an option.
So ultimately, maybe, being so aware of okay, well, we have to stay lean to an extent, that's going to promote innovation and promote reasons why we're going to find.
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
Yeah,
exactly right.
Gotcha.
Yep.
How cool. Okay, well, that's awesome. And I do want to chat about, right, obviously you're at the present now, you're working at Adobe. It's one of the largest computer software companies in the world. What has it been like adjusting to the scale of an enterprise like Adobe? And what do you think are some of the unique challenges that have come along with working at an organization of this size?
Yeah. So as you can tell from my CV and LinkedIn, I haven't worked at a lot of giant companies, relatively giant. And I think I had this first experience at McKinsey, probably, where I, again, sort of an innovation team inside a larger company, ostensibly a client service company at McKinsey, but particularly building a new kind of practice with a platform around educational technology. I learned there that there's, I don't know, sometimes I call this the tax. There's the McKinsey tax or the big company tax. And I don't mean it as a negative necessarily, but it's not as easy to hire in a big company. There are processes, as there should be. Adjusting compensation as a process, as there must be. Governance is more difficult than just making a capricious decision, over a beer with your co-founder saying, hey, what if we hire this friend of mine? She's amazing and we should do it. Yeah, sounds good. Cheers. or let's take $100,000 out of the money we just raised and buy this product that will accelerate engineering. Sound good? Good. In a larger company, there is a process that's required to make decisions like that. And because now accountability has to go all the way up to the CEO of a, many tens of thousands person enterprise. In the case of Adobe, a public company too, where certain decisions can impact shareholders, and you are a shareholder as an employee. So I think what I learned is that you have to make room and allot time for those kinds of things. So paying that big company tax as a leader results in dividends, to extend the metaphor, because you have the heft of a big company behind you, and you don't have to hire an HR team. You have one that is expert at top of its game, leveraging it because there's lots of people making asks of that same team. Sometimes takes a little bit more time. So it's different. I can't say it's better or worse, but there is a learning experience, which is how do you function as an innovative organization of a certain size, but also make room for the processes that larger companies necessarily have for you.
So it sounds like, a lot of red tape, but ultimately you don't necessarily feel throttled by that because you do see value in the results that those big processes get you.
Yeah, and again, ultimately, the benefit is you're working for one of these big companies where now you're not looking at the bank balance necessarily. You might be looking at the share price every now and then.
Sure.
But you have a certain cushion against which you can push and pull that doesn't require constantly watching revenue as a team, producing a product. Not to say that we don't, obsess over revenue at the company. Of course we do. It's the reason that one of the reasons Adobe's been so successful. But balancing innovation with those kinds of concerns it's a bit easier. And that's the benefit of, having lots of products that have their market moment, and then maybe they have less of a market moment and they come back. And with this give and take and diversity of products, somewhat ironically, it allows you to focus more on your core area of expertise and make it as accretive to the company as it can be.
Fantastic. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk, a little more broadly about what engineering leadership means to you, or some of your takeaways from your experience. And I know we've touched on this a little bit already, but I'm curious if you do you have something in mind in terms of what qualities are essential for being an effective leader at a tech org or at a tech first org?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been asked it many times. I keep changing my answer, so take this all with a grain of salt. Because I think there are a lot of qualities. It's hard to boil them down into two or three. I think, number one, as I said before, it's about being decisive. You can't just walk into an organization or start a company and say, I'm decisive. I make decisions. You have to earn the right and the respect of your colleagues and people working on your team to say, people who work with you, and I do these kinds of 360 feedback bits every chance I can get. And the question I sometimes ask is what do you think of my decision-making prowess, if you will? And I sometimes get surprising answers. And this is often a blind spot for a lot of technology leaders who make decisions, who move forward, who get kudos for making those decisions and, seeing the revenue impact or the team impact from their leadership, but sometimes don't pause and ask the people they work with directly, what do you think of my decisions? Because they're not looking at revenue. They're looking at the impact of the team, the quality of the product, whether they're proud to, tell their parents or their kids, hey, I made this thing, look at it. And in whatever small way and over time, large ways, the decisions you make as a technology leader impact that directly. And that goes to people's motivation, their sense of fulfillment and whether they're reaching their goals, and just life quality. Do you love what you do? Not because I said you should, but because you really do. And the decisions I make as a leader give you the kind of air cover to make your own decisions. And lastly, to make sure that, being decisive, making good decisions when you know you can, and even bad decisions where there's risk, and being transparent about it, as I said before, it's just an essential quality. And I think it takes time to build. You can't read a book about that. You can read a book about that, but it won't result in you being good at it. The second one, and this is probably an overused word, is be authentic and vulnerable. And I sort of roll my eyes a little bit when I even hear myself say that, because these are such overused, meme-like ideas, especially in engineering leadership.
But maybe for a reason.
For a reason, exactly what I was going to say. There's a reason for it. And the reason is, you may not be in the trenches coding alongside somebody or like pair programming, but there has to be a mutual respect based on what you do, and also separating yourself, right? The best leaders don't lead from a position of saying, hey, Christopher, I can do your job. That's why I'm your leader. Sometimes people do. It's a mistake. I've seen it. But instead from saying, I used to kind of do what you do, but you're here because you are way smarter than me. That's not just lip service. Like, I hired you or I'm working with you because you're doing your job in a superior way, and you're doing it in a way that nobody else can in this company. And I'm going to run interference for you. Sometimes people call this servant leadership. That's sort of the name that's applied to it. I'm going to run interference. I'm going to make sure that you can do your job. And if you feel that anything I'm doing or the environment around you is impeding your ability to do the best job you can, then let's talk and let me see what I can do about that. Critically, because I've been there, not because I can do it now, but I've been writing code. I've been unhappy. I know how that can impact a person. So, again, like not to overdo the kind of learning hard lessons, but being able to say, like, I have empathy for you as an engineer or a product person or an up and coming leader in the company, because to some extent, I've experienced a lot of what you're experiencing now. So that's important. I would call that quality, empathetic leadership, for lack of a better one. And the last one I would highlight is just, you can't fake having fun and enjoying your job. And again, I've seen people try it. For a short time, I was even in a position myself where I was like, I think I want to lead this team. I took a job. I was excited about it. I was excited about the CEO I was working for, somebody I knew. And I found myself, a few weeks in, kind of presenting this facade of enjoying what I was doing and not having the courage personally to say, I don't think this is for me. Eventually, I did have that courage, perhaps too late, and I made a change for myself. But if you find yourself in a position where you are having fun and loving it despite the challenges, and I'm 100% doing that now at Adobe, you got to let people know. Like, you just have to allow it to exude out of your pores, because there's no better catalyst for like team cohesion, productivity, and fun, for lack of a better term, than you yourself displaying like, hey, I love this team. You guys are kicking ass. And we're doing something really important here. And I don't care if it's like world-changing idea or you're building a product for an esoteric industry. Like, if you feel it, you just have to think every morning about, how do I show it in an authentic way. I don't have a single word name for that, but that's an important quality.
Yeah, we don't have to wrap that one in a bow. But I do love that, like, given your current role at Adobe, that so much of this answer comes back to authenticity, but both as being, a truly empathetic leader, but also, authentically loving your current role, loving your team, and what that does for morale and just for moving the team forward. That's fantastic. Right. So you mentioned, getting that feedback on your decision-making skills. Where do you think that feedback should come from? And especially as an individual grows and they go from, being a manager to a director or a senior director or a VP, like, at what point are we getting that feedback from our direct reports versus all the way down into the trenches of the engineering team? What do you think?
Yeah. So naturally, you don't want to overburden, people kind of further down the leadership ladder with constantly asking, hey, how was that? How did I do? Leadership will tell you. You don't have to solicit opinions from your leadership about your decision-making ability. They might say, hey, that was a good decision, Andy. But it'll be evident in the conversations you have, like in the boardroom or with your CEO or leadership in a big company. So that comes when it comes, and it's relatively constant, and it's one kind of leadership. And by the way, the same decision-making feedback you get from your leaders, your peers, at the same time, a particular decision, the feedback could be very different. And for me, the best learning experiences are like somebody who I don't work with on a daily basis, like a skip level or, a manager of a manager of a manager, has a very different regard if they're going to aware that a decision was made. Sometimes for somebody who's, kind of earlier in their career, the best thing is for them to be unaware of such a decision. Like, you're doing a good job if these things are not headline news every day.
Right.
For your peers and people you work with, a CTO working with a chief product officer or a CTO who also runs product, where people are scrutinizing your decisions in a healthy way, then I find it's a good idea periodically to stop and get that feedback. And then what I think it's also more to pay attention to, which you didn't talk about, is to think, maybe even on a monthly basis about what decisions did you not make? It's not always necessary to make every decision, but there are always decisions pending. You can't make all of them. And by the way, that might be like making a change on the team. It might be, putting some kind of career action in place so somebody can improve. It might be reorganizing your team. It might be saying, hey, this bug tracking tool, I've heard it's not great. Like, is now the time? So there's like reactive decisions, proactive decisions. The proactive ones are the easiest to ignore because there's nothing on fire. There's no acute problem that you're solving. And sometimes those are the least visible ones. So, they come in the form of, hey, Pierre, Chief Product Officer, how do you think my team is operating? Like, what with your interface, and what are you hearing from your folks? Like, are we providing you what you need? Are we giving you quick answers to questions? Are we asking you good questions? Are we building what you expect? And the answer may be a consequence of decisions that I've made recently that my colleague might not even be aware of. So I think it's a particular kind of feedback. It's a little different than how am I doing? And I think it's the most important thing in leadership, which is like, what is the right decision? How do I strategize to execute it properly? And then what do people think of that? So I do think it's important to get it from everywhere, but people, if you're doing a good job, a lot of those micro decisions should not even be visible.
You're right. No news is good news sometimes. So I think something that a lot of engineering leaders face is, we were even talking not too long ago about the importance of innovation on a team, but of course there is the bottom line at the end of the day of, hey, well, we do need to deliver X product, or we do need to meet X deadline, so that we can have happy customers, that we can grow the business in a linear way. How do we balance this sort of delicate situation when we're trying to foster innovation, but we also have to meet deadlines? How do you approach that with your engineering teams?
Yeah, so there are two kinds of rewards in success. And I don't mean like compensation rewards for engineers, but one is, let's build something cool, even or especially if it's speculative, because it's going to be really fun to build. We're going to innovate. We're going to do something new. With innovation comes risk. Otherwise, I would say if there's no risk, you're not really innovating, because the definition is you're doing something new or approaching an old problem in a novel way. So I think those are just like sort of empirically fun and motivating, assuming you like the business that the company's in. The other kind, and you touched on it, Christopher, is customers need this. It may be less fun. It might not be innovative at all, right? We may need to re-platform our database. We may need to optimize our SQL. We may need to add database indexes, whatever it is, like add a new UI, rebuild something we already built. That was a common one. The payoff and the reward there is to set some, I don't care if it's KPIs or OKRs or some other kind of metrics, but to say, we're going to do this, and we're not going to pat ourselves on the back because we made a new thing or we optimized something and it was fun and innovative. We're going to do this because I think that this is going to result in a thing that the business needs, either a bump in revenue. And by the way, I am on the hook for this OKR to my CEO, that is to boost revenue or increase usage or double MAU in the next 2 months. Here's a decision. I'm going to tell you that we follow this thing that might be boring for the next 2 months. We're going to put this team on it, or we're going to make an all hands effort. It's not innovative, but it is going to result in this result. The company needs it. Again, if you love the business you're in, if you like the company and you think you're in the right place, that's rewarding. What's less rewarding is doing 100% of either, like working on innovation all the time, which often doesn't have direct impact or has a long, R&D cycle. Balancing that with things that have a more direct impact that's predictable and that you can see. It's not easy. In some ways, it's a non-answer. It's like, do that, like, be a good leader. But it's also, if you squint at any business problem or any company, there are both kinds of opportunities in front of you pretty much at all times. And saying, now we're going to have this group of people work on something novel and new and see if it pays off. It may not. And we're also going to kind of ensure that we keep the gas tank full and accelerate by doing something that might be less fun and innovative, but will have a very direct impact. See the direct impact, or build something that's innovative, even if it ends up on the shelf in the lab. Not easy to do, but at the end of the day, the best leaders are able to do that, and their teammates say, "Yeah, I do both those things." Like when it's time to feed the meter and optimize something or redo that UI that we just finished, we do that because we see the results.
And you sort of mentioned there that, like, this should be empirically enjoyable one way or the other to the right individual, perhaps. And I wonder, like, is this something that you keep in mind when you're hiring, in terms of like, I need to know that this individual will authentically enjoy doing A or B or both, or how else do you, like, what other metrics do you look for when you're trying to hire skilled engineers in this extremely competitive market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have some interview questions, and folks on my teams have interview questions that I ask them to explore. Sometimes they're wide open ones, like, the typical one. Tell me about a recent project that you were primarily responsible for, or like materially contributed to, that you're excited about. And by the way, that can be something that didn't work, that you learned something from, or it can be something that went live and had impact in whatever way you choose to define impact. And you let people choose. Sometimes people will give you a rehearsed answer, but it's possible to kind of get them out of their comfort zone, ask the right questions, and this is where it helps to be relatively technical, to say, oh, that's interesting. I think you're describing a queue structure, like, without getting too esoteric. Why? You can just sort of gauge how passionate people were. Now, if they chose, one of those feed the meter kinds of projects, that's somebody you might want on the team if you have those needs. If you ask repeatedly, okay, cool, what about that project at your last company? I understand you were part of this team. What did you do on that team? If people only grab like the innovative thing because they're either trying to impress you, or it's really where their passion is, like to constantly innovate, that might not be somebody that is right for a team that has to balance the two things. Because what you don't want to do is say, oh, here's somebody who will just do, for lack of a better term, the grunt work, and here's somebody who's going to innovate. That breeds, a level of distrust between teams. You're good at this thing and you're good at this other thing. It doesn't mean everybody has to be a generalist, but it does mean that everybody has to feed the meter and be ready to jump onto an innovative team. And there are countless ways to do that, right? Sometimes people rotate teams. There's an innovation center. As you scale, you can be more deliberate about the org structure reflecting that. But of course, when you're small, these things pop up when needed, and you kind of need people who are able to do both. So I think the answer to your question is yes, there are very specific kinds of individuals you hire at a particular time in the company's life cycle so that you can balance both at the right time for the maturity of that organization.
Let me ask you this, just because this is such an important topic in a post-COVID world, and since you have such interesting experience with it in your career, you've worked both in office and with distributed teams. You're probably having to make those decisions when it comes to hiring, and depending on the team, are we hiring offshore? Are we hiring locally? Is it truly local? What do if we're going to distill it down to in-person versus remote work, what are the trade-offs? What are your thoughts on it? I mean, right now it's so important to so many leaders. Tell me about your insights.
Yeah. So most of my insights are derived from living through COVID, like we all did, where people were forced, whether they wanted to or not. And it's not an obvious thing that everybody prefers working from home, right? Many people do. But even among the people who prefer working from home all the time, or remote part of the time, hybrid, the truth is that you don't hear talked about very much. Like, some people are good at it and some people are not good at it, right? So wanting to be home with your family, wanting to deal with the pressures of childcare, like, of course, like we afford people the ability to do that. But it doesn't mean that you get for free somebody who's good at working remote. Like, some people are just not. I myself have struggled with working remote sometimes, where they're distractions or it's hard to think, even though I'm in the, this room in my house. I need to get out. I need to see people. I need to feel like I'm part of something. So I think many leaders, to some degree, myself included, just assume that, if we wanted, we could tell our organization, be hybrid, be remote, be in the office, and everybody would do equally well with that. It's just not the case. Like, some people are really good at working remote. They've been doing it since before COVID and learned how to do it. Other people are not. Nobody bought that like 35 square foot New York City studio thinking that they'd be stuck in it doing work for 8+ hours a day. So I think, the answer is the one you hear about a lot, which is like hybrid work is a good answer. Adobe really prizes in-person. Adobe's a 40-year-old company. As you would expect, it really prizes in-person interactions and whiteboarding and things like that, with a really healthy respect that I've always had, especially through COVID, that, those in-person days are not going to be like super productive output days. They're specifically meant for social interaction. And if you excise social interaction in favor of being 100% productive all the time, you really lose something that results in a less good company culture and probably a less good team output. And by output, I mean all the things related to what gets you excited about work. And that'll be reflected in your product, whatever your product is eventually. So, my advice to people with teams of all sizes is like, find the right balance for you. There's not going to be, again, many books have been written about this and will be written about this. There's not a recipe for success here, but I would start with understanding which people on your team and which teams collectively are actually able to work remotely effectively. And it's the case that some people really crave office culture, and finding the right balance without making people feel disenfranchised or forced into anything, if you have the luxury to do that, which we do at Adobe, is just much more effective. And I would say the thing coming out of the COVID period that is a luxury that many companies and individuals didn't have before is the ability for leadership to decide what works best. And I've tried to really make the most of that ability to decide.
That's incredible. And I mean, like we said, it's such an important topic right now because of living in this post-COVID world. But I think that's probably a take that people don't stop to consider enough in terms of, on an individual level. Like, does this make sense for person A versus person B versus approaching it as an org and just saying, well, we're either doing this or we're doing that. Probably right. Didn't stop. Yeah, we're stopping to consider at that level for sure. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, sharing your incredible insights. I look forward personally to continuing to watch your career, your growth, and I wish you all the success in the world. And I'm going to look out for your jazz album, which I believe is due for release mid-year. Is that right?
There are a couple, actually. If you go to Bandcamp, this is not a plug, but if you can find me on Bandcamp, you can see some of that stuff. It used to be on Spotify, but I think we stopped paying attention to that. So
gotcha.
Bandcamp it is.
Here I am trying to give you a hard time, but no, of course we actually have something. So now I get to go look on Bandcamp and actually listen. That's incredible. Well, thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you grow and watching your career with definitely great interest.
Thanks, Christopher. I enjoyed the conversation very much.